So a killer motive really, I think the initial idea was somebody goes missing on somebody's watch, and what does that do to a family? What does that do to the person that's left behind? And what does it do with their relationship with their family? At this point, I hadn't decided it was siblings. And then I look back at the books I'd written and I go, the neighbors, okay, that was husband and wife, and her secret son, that was stepfather and stepson, and so forth. I thought, oh, I haven't really written a story that's purely from siblings and older sister, specifically older sister, younger brother. So how would that work? And I didn't want Max, who disappears, to be young. I wanted him to be almost an adult, so he's a few days shy, couple of weeks shy of his 80th birthday. And Stella is 4 years older, so she sneaks him out of the house, and he's been grounded. He's in trouble with his mum, and what could possibly go wrong? Well, everything. So yeah, that's our job, right? To make things in thrillers, to make things go really, really badly. So that was the idea initially for a killer motive, a disappearance, and then figuring out who's disappeared. And I wanted it to be. I remember thinking, I want the person who disappears to be a guy, because there's lots and lots of books about women disappearing, and I thought it'd be interesting to see what happens when it's a young man, and the sister's left behind, and it's her fault. Well, her fault. It's not her fault. I mean, person who takes him. It's their fault, obviously, but she feels responsible because she was the one who busted him out of their parents' house. 6 years later, Stella's brother Max is still missing. There's no trace of him has ever been found. It's basically a cold case. Um, there's no indication of foul play. Could have been. So the question remains: did he harm himself? Um, did he have an accident? Did somebody hurt him? He was at the beach. Is his body just lost to the sea? There's just no evidence of anything really, and that's part of the problem for Stella, because she has zero answers, zero clues, effectively. So a couple of years after Max's disappearance, she puts out this podcast, not branded. She just kind of talks about his disappearance and sends her ramblings out into the ether, not thinking that anything's really going to come of it. And two things happen. One, it inspires her to launch this podcast called A Killer Motive, where she helps families, other families who are suffering, find closure potentially as best she can. So helping others helps her, it gives her a sense of closure, I guess, in not in regards to Max, but it just helps her heal partially that wound of him disappearing. She feels like she's contributing something positive to the world. So she has this podcast with her best friend Vivian, but they're in financial dire straits because advertising money's not coming in. So they head off to a radio show called People of Portland to promote A Killer Motive. And while on air, Stella says that if she had a single clue about Max's whereabouts, she'd find him, and if somebody hurt him, she'd find the perp and she'd bring them to justice, and she'd go beyond the ends of the earth. And she doesn't really talk about Max on air or on A Killer Motive, because when that initial podcast, the unbranded one, if you like, went out, she took a lot of heat for it. People are saying, oh, it's not real, you made it up, or you're trying to benefit from your brother's disappearance, or he doesn't even exist, and all this kind of, the trolls come for her, he's an actor, blah, 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 all of that stuff that we observe in the real world when tragedies happen. So she's very, very reluctant to even talk about Max on air. When she investigates his disappearance, she does it, behind closed doors on her own time. But somebody on the radio show forces her hand, and so now she's put it out there that if she had a single clue, she would find him. And somebody nefarious takes her at her word, and the terrible, despicable game begins. I had a fantastic conversation with Laura Norton. She runs a podcast called The Fall Line, and that specifically looks into cold cases. And I happened to meet her at a Toronto conference called Motive. It's the crime writing murder mystery festival that happens in June. And she was on a panel. It was a fascinating panel. She's extraordinary. And I got her to stood in line, got her to sign the book. And I said, I'm writing a book about the host of a podcast whose brother, I just said the host of a podcast. And she asked me a question. She said, well, what's her motivation? What kind of a podcast is it? And I said, well, it's a about cold cases. And she said, yes, but what kind? Does it sensationalize? What is the purpose of the book? And I thought that is such a great question, and that helped inform me about Stella's character, because she is completely against sensationalizing anything. She just wants to solve these cases. She wants to bring closure to families. And when I said to Laura, well, her brother went missing, she said, so it's a personal relationship with, that's why it's a personal incentive or motivation, if you like. That's why she's doing this, because she wants closure for herself, but wants to bring closure to others. That is what's driving Stella. And that was such a great conversation, because it really helped shape Stella and the person that she is. She's very big on, we have to have permission from the families of the cold cases that we're looking into. And we also have to respect the family of any suspects, because this isn't easy for them either. They often get forgotten in this situation. And we also have to be tread very carefully when it comes to divulge anything about the victims, because, as you mentioned, very often the sensationalizing is about the serial killers, but when the victims, they're a byproduct of, yeah, it's what they did. They hurt them, but we don't learn much about them, and we should. And there are a couple of books that deal with that. So that was really, really interesting. And out of personal experience, um, my best friend was murdered when I was 23, and he was the son of a cult leader, and I had no idea. He defected. He'd blown the whistle on the cult. He'd got out, and I had no idea of any of this. And this was over 30 years ago. And it's only recently coincided with the 30th anniversary of the tragedy, I guess, that there've been TV shows and podcasts, because there's a whole generation who never even heard of this mass murder suicide that happened. And it's also the first time that I've been able to watch any of this stuff or listen to any of this stuff, because I just couldn't deal with it. But dealing with it and watching these TV shows, these documentaries that haven't sensationalized it at all, actually, that it's very factual. This is what happened. These were the people who were involved. This was the investigation, has really helped me, because I used to not be able to listen to or watch anything that had anything to do with cults. No books, no TV shows, no. There was once an FBI, I think, episode that dealt with a cult, and I just said, okay, guys, see you later. I'm out. But now it doesn't scare me anymore, because I have a much better understanding. It doesn't make it any easier to accept, of course, but it has taken that fear of who these people were and what they did away. And I can now read about it and understand, and that's what I'm really interested in, is the psychology behind it, how this happened, why this happened. And I think there's a lot of people who do go through tragedy one way or another. And I think podcasts or TV shows or whatnot, when well done, can be extremely helpful and beneficial to a lot of people.